Welcome everyone to our Zoom chat today. We are excited to have you with us. We've had a couple of workshops for high school students, and we're really happy that you took some time this afternoon to join us. And today we're talking about successful tips for your virtual interview. During the pandemic, a lot of you might be experiencing virtual interviews because you can't go into an office or a place of business for that face-to-face interview. So with us today is Nicole Barlass. She's the Executive Director of Operations at CESA 2, our organization, and she is a very experienced human resources director and is with us today to share some tips for your future virtual interview. If you haven't used Zoom before, you'll see that there is a chat window and it should pop up with a little orange box. So I'm saying hello to you in the chat. If you have a question, please use the chat box. I will be moderating and we'll read those questions as you have them. And we would encourage you to ask. So we're here to support you and make sure
about that particular potential issue. I would also note that LinkedIn is becoming increasingly a place where employers are looking for information, and it can be very helpful in getting your foot in the door, making connections. I know a lot of professors at the university level will provide some sort of indication that you've met certain qualifications that you can then include in your LinkedIn profile, and that can be very useful as you're looking for a position. And then let's talk about setup. Before you start any virtual interview, you'll want to make sure that you have all of your devices and gadgets in order and at the ready. You'll want to check and make sure that your microphone and webcam are working properly. You'll want to make sure that your computer, if you're using a laptop, is fully charged so that doesn't become an issue for you in the middle of an interview. And you'll also want to ensure that you have sufficient lighting in whatever location you're going to be conducting your interview from, and that you have a clear video feed coming through. For instance, if you're using a personal hotspot for wireless, that can cause issues in terms of video quality. So if you can at all possible, I would highly recommend connecting to a wired, hardwired connection. If not, I'd try to find the most stable Wi-Fi connection that you can, just to ensure that your video feed and your audio feed come through clearly during the interview process. You'll also want to take a look at your surroundings. I would always test your video that way to see what you appear as to the other participants in the interview. You can see behind me, I've made sure I have just a blank background, and you'll also want to think about what's behind you and make sure that it's professional and what you would want someone who is interviewing you to see. Also, I would caution you don't want to position yourself in front of a window because you'll get a lot of glare and you'll end up, as you can see in that bad photo, with your face being much darker and with all the light behind you. So think about those things as you're deciding where you'll set up for your virtual interview.
So Nicole, Zoom has a lot of the backgrounds, the images that you can download. What are your thoughts about those?
You know, I would personally avoid using them particularly in this type of an environment with a virtual interview, mainly because I've noticed that even with Zoom's built-in backgrounds, there is sort of a weird effect that can happen when you turn your head and things like that, where it's the computer is filling in the pixels for that. So I don't think that they look terribly professional, but you can certainly test things and see if it works well. But I would recommend trying to have as professional a standard background as possible, just a real life background.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for mentioning that.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that you'll want to think about is appearance. You do want to still continue, just as you would for an in-person interview, making sure that your dress is appropriate for being in an interview and be professional. Obviously, with a virtual interview, mainly people are just seeing you from the shoulders up, but you still want to think about, I would think about the whole outfit still. I think it's been very clearly proven that, putting on an outfit, putting on a uniform, it lends you a sense of professionalism that you wouldn't necessarily have if you have kind of a professional top, but you've still got jammy bottoms on. So think about that. I would also recommend taking a look at some potential outfits on screen, seeing how they come across. Sometimes colors can come through strangely through a video conferencing app. So I would think about that. I would check that out and avoid things that are kind of too loud or too busy, because they can be very distracting, especially in a 2D environment of a video conference. So consider just you can see today I have kind of a brighter top, but it's hopefully coming through not too loudly, but a little bit of visual interest. So think about that. As I said, I would definitely try on some outfits and see how they come across on the screen. And then maintaining eye contact. This one I think is particularly hard in that you are so used to, when you see yourself in a video feed, it's very hard not to look at yourself. But when you're doing an interview, that's going to come across as if you're not looking directly into the interviewer's eyes. So as strange as it might be, you'll kind of want to pretend that you are on TV or a supermodel or whatever idea works for you, and look at the camera. Pretend that the camera is the eye line for the other person that you're talking to, and that will convey that you are looking at them and not somewhere else. As we note, it's a really good idea to practice with friends so you kind of get the hang of that, because it does feel kind of strange, and it is, I think, just sort of human nature to be distracted by your own image and look at yourself. So.
Thank you.
And then the other thing that you want to keep in mind is keeping a positive posture. You'll want to make sure that your head and shoulders are fitting in well into the camera view. You'll want to try to sit steadily and speak while you're leaning forward. You'll also want to smile and try not to look around during the interview, because that sort of would convey that you are not as engaged as you should be. So those are some tips to keep in mind. Some other things I would suggest, Tom Ford actually gave some, if you know him, he's a fashion designer, gave some tips on sort of the best way to set up your area. And he suggested, if you don't have like a stand, I have a stand right now that I'm using to put my laptop on so that it's raised up a little bit, but you can always use some books. He also recommended putting like a desk lamp or something like that close to your head, out of screen, obviously, but to provide some light onto your face, and that can be very helpful. So some things to keep in mind. The other thing I would always recommend as well is that you close any other windows that you might have open on your laptop or computer, so that those aren't distracting for you and you can really focus on the interview. And also that will ensure that if you had any sort of notification systems enabled on your device, that those won't pop up with sound notifications while you're having your interview, because that can be very distracting both for you and for the interviewers, and it will come off as less professional. I also recommended that you turn off your phone completely, and I would probably leave it somewhere else so that isn't a distraction either, so that you can be fully present in the interview. That is so important as someone who does a lot of interviews, I want to know that you want to be here, that you are really interested in this position and are very engaged in the process. That helps me to know that that's the kind of employee you will be as well. The other thing that you will want to think about is practicing a virtual handshake. Obviously, there's been some talk that handshakes will go out the window, even in the actual world. But obviously, you can't provide a handshake over Zoom. So, we recommend not waving at the interviewer. You can instead kind of just nod to greet them. And indicate that you are ready to go. So I would suggest practicing that, because it will probably feel a little awkward at first doing that, but practice that a little bit, and that should become more comfortable and will indicate your greeting to the people who are interviewing you. So other tips to keep in mind is you want to take your time in answering the questions that are posed to you. There's no reason why you shouldn't take a few moments to process the question that was asked of you and formulate your answer. That's always going to come off a lot better than starting to just kind of fumble through something. And you'll want to, as much as possible, really connect to what the question is. It's interesting. I think that's one of the things that we find is the main reason why we choose either not to hire someone or not to bring someone back for a second interview, is because they don't provide enough detailed response, or they actually don't even answer the question at all. So it's perfectly okay, and interviewers will expect you to take a little bit of time to process what's been asked of you and formulate your response. The other thing I would recommend that you do prior to the interview is, based on the position that you're interviewing in, try to anticipate what are some typical questions that you'll be asked, and formulate some answers for them. That way you kind of have that going in, and you're not trying to just respond off the cuff. That will be really helpful. There's lots of resources online of what are some typical questions asked, and there are also resources that get very specific to what are the typical questions that might be asked for a particular position. So I'd recommend looking at those and providing some time for yourself to prepare some typical answers to those questions that are likely to crop up in an interview. For instance, interviewers often are going to ask about your education and background. So I would take some time to formulate a response for that feels very natural for you. So that's often the first question that will be asked. And so it's nice to, hit a home run right away with a nice, clear, concise answer for that. Other questions that are often asked will be around your strengths, questions around your weaknesses. There will often be questions about how you interact with colleagues. And I think often, typically, you'll be asked about conflict resolution, how you handle conflicts that will arise in the workplace. So those are some things that you'll want to kind of have answers prepared for, so that you can kind of more quickly respond to certain questions. Obviously, there's always going to be some oddball questions that are thrown in there from some interviewers, or also just more technical specific questions that you might not be totally able to prepare for. And then again, you'll want to just take the time to process the question and formulate a clear response to it.
Great. That was actually a question in our chat, was, what are some of those common questions? There's also a question in the chat about how long are employers averaging on an interview. And she said that she heard the most recent job fair was 4 minutes each per person.
Oh, interesting. Yes. It depends on what stage of the interview process you're talking about. I would say if you're thinking of a typical kind of phone initial screening, that can often be fairly short. I would say anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes is fairly typical. A job fair is going to be much shorter just because you have so many more people that you're trying to get information from to see if they might be a good fit to move forward with. I would say in either an in-person or a virtual first interview is typically going to be, I would say, between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. I've sometimes seen them run to an hour, but that's fairly rare. And again, I would say I'm happy to provide some resources on what are some typical questions, but it's always a good idea if you're interviewing for a particular type of position to do a little Googling. You can usually find lots of HR resources out there about what are some of the questions that will be asked of you for that type of position. But I'm happy to share some resources as well on that, and I can email that out to everyone.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is really crucial. You want to be the real you. Make sure that your interviews get a sense of who you really are. It's both to your benefit and to the prospective company's benefit. So much of what makes or breaks an employment and relationship is fit within a culture. So employers are really looking to make sure that they understand who you are and that that it's a good fit for both of you. So you really want to make sure that you're being very honest about your strengths. This is not the time to embellish what you've done. You want to make sure that you are really truthfully conveying your experience and the knowledge that you have and the skills that you can bring. And I realize it can be very difficult when you're first entering the job market because you don't always have a lot of experience that you can speak to. But there's lots of ways in which you can convey your strengths and abilities and how they will translate into being a good professional in that company based on your educational experiences, your volunteer experiences, and just how you've interacted with people in the world. So there are ways that you can do that. And then lastly, I always recommend that you send some kind of follow-up to the interviewers, indicating that you appreciated that they took the time to speak with you, and that you're excited about the opportunity. It always sets apart those that we've interviewed, that we receive those kind of thank you notes from the rest of the group. It's a very professional thing to do. It also gives you the opportunity to kind of stand out from the crowd a little bit more. And you can also take that opportunity to follow up on any of the questions that you answered with maybe some more information or clarification. If there's something that you wished that you had said in the interview, sometimes you can mention it then in the thank you note, and it gives you an opportunity to make that one more connection and show that you are a professional who will be a good fit for the company or agency or whatever entity you're interviewing with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. We have time for questions. If you have them. I can tell you while you're thinking about your questions, I have twin sons who will be 16 in a couple of weeks, and they had a virtual interview for work as dock hands this summer. So they had a Zoom interview. It was about 15-20 minutes. And in terms of the questions, Nicole is absolutely right. They were asked questions about their experience with boats. They were asked questions about their work ethic, and because they're twins, this was very interesting. They were asked to describe the qualities of their brother, and so as you're preparing for the interviews, you might think about what would other people say are my qualities? What am I really good at? That could be helpful. And there's a great question. If there's an issue with the interpreter while interviewing a deaf person, what other ways is there to continue the interview? So Nicole, your thoughts on that in terms of modifying an interview?
Yes, that is a very good question. I would probably try to anticipate that if possible, when you are scheduling the interview, um, and see if there's some way that you can maybe use the chat window instead to ask questions and respond to questions. I think Zoom has a closed captioning component that can be used, so that might be another option. So yeah, I think there are definitely things that you could do, um, and I guess that's kind of what I would recommend. But I can see if there's any other potential options out there that might be worthwhile to look into.
Mhm. And I think that's a good rule as well, just from my own experiences. If there are modifications or adaptations that you need, it would probably be helpful to communicate that to the employer. And we're saying that due to ADA law, technically the place of employment would need to provide the interpreter. What's a good way to contact prior? My thought would be, however they reached out to you, so if it was a phone call, an email, I would use that same mode of communication and give them, the information that I need an interpreter, or, whatever it might be. If you have a visual impairment, if you need some screen modifications, I would reach out in the same mode that they reached to you. And then there's a question. This is a great question and one that happens to me all the time. What advice would you have about being ready if you're really nervous for an interview?
Yes. That is totally understandable. Everyone, and I guess the one thing I would say right away is everybody's nervous going into an interview. Even when you've interviewed lots of times, it still is just a little nerve-wracking. So I think there's a few things that you can do. One, I would be as prepared as possible. Really think about what are some questions, prepare some answers, and then I would practice with someone. I would find a friend or whoever is available and would be a good sport about it, and have them interview you. You can kind of use that to kind of build up the muscle of not being as anxious about it. Having been someone who did a fair amount of acting as a young person, practicing my lines over and over again in front of my parents really helped me to feel ready to go out there. And I think that it's very similar for an interview situation. um, I, I would also just suggest taking some time before the interview to do whatever feels comfortable for you to kind of get you in the right mindset and feel ready to go. That might be, some deep breaths, some meditation, some sort of a mindfulness exercise, and that should help too. Um, I would also just let you know that most interviewers totally understand that it can be a nerve-wracking experience, and they, especially if it's one of the first interviews you've ever done, because that just happens to be the position in life that you're in. So don't feel like you're going to be judged harshly for for being nervous. That is a very natural and normal reaction. But again, I would think about, what things can you do that you've maybe done in the past, and where you've been in a situation that feels kind of uncomfortable, that that have worked for you to kind of help you be more comfortable in the situation. But again, I think practicing, being prepared, and also just giving yourself a little bit of grace that you'll get through this and it's going to be okay. Those are all good tips.
Yeah, I had a teacher that used to say, if you're nervous, it means that this is important to you.
Yeah.
And so just realizing to yourself, wow, I really want this job. It's really important to me that I do well. That's why I'm nervous, but I'm going to be prepared and do the best I can.
Yeah. I
Another
think that's
great,
excellent advice, Val.
thank you. Another great question. What should you say if you don't know the answer to a question, and how do you respond to that in a formal way?
Sure, absolutely. I would say something along the lines of, it kind of depends a little bit on exactly what the question is, but so perhaps it's, have you ever, done this particular data entry before, or something along those lines. I would just say, I haven't had any experience with that particular thing, but here is what I can speak to. As much as possible, I would try to connect something else to what they're asking if you can. It's also, perfectly okay to say, I I'm not familiar with that, but I'd love to learn more. Can you tell me more about that? I'd probably try to get more information so that I can try to answer the question as best I can. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's okay for you to say, that's a great question. I'm not sure of the answer, because that tells your employer that that you're genuine, and that in a work environment, if you don't know an answer to a customer's question, you won't just make something up, but that you'll find the right answer.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that happens in interviews all the time, even to people who are, extreme professionals. Sometimes you get thrown a question that you don't know the answer to.
Absolutely.
This question says, if you're not ready for the job, talk with your boss, interview. So I'm not exactly sure. Jonathan is asking, maybe what you might do if I'm guessing if you feel like you're not ready for the interview. Is it okay to ask to have a different time?
Yeah, I think that you could certainly, but I would be a little bit cautious on that. Generally, employers are working with a timeline, but you can certainly, if you find that like you won't have enough time, if they've asked you to participate in an interview, for instance, on a Thursday, and you're not going to have enough time to get ready for the interview by that day or time, you certainly can say that won't work out the best for me. Would it be possible to look at next week sometime? Employers certainly understand that. So if you can be flexible, that's helpful. But interviewers are certainly going to understand if there's a date and time that's not going to work with you or work for you, that you might need to ask for a different day and time, and that will give you a little bit more time to prepare for it and feel ready and comfortable for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, oh, okay. Thank you. So just to clarify that question, if I need to contact my boss quickly, or my boss needs me to respond quickly, as a deaf individual, is it better to email, text, or use a phone, or have a family member or friend interpret for me? Nicole, do you have experience in terms of your preference for communication?
No, none at all. I would say use the method that you're most comfortable using. People communicate me in a variety of ways, and that's totally acceptable. Whatever is easiest and best for you to communicate is fine. I've gotten
Absolutely.
communications in all modes and methods, so yeah, I would use
Perfect.
whichever one is most comfortable for you.
Yeah, and Daviana follows up with that, and she asks, after they hire you, then you can ask them how they would prefer to be contacted, and that's great advice as well. So after you're hired, you can ask. I've had employers that prefer text for when my boys have had summer jobs and such, and some want an email or a phone call. So I think that's a great question. This is a good one. So in a face-to-face interview, sometimes we're told to get there 15 minutes ahead of time. How early should you show up for a virtual interview?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say I would be I would still be ready to go in terms of you being all set to join the virtual interview 15 minutes before yet.
Mhm.
And that will give you, again, if you are having any kind of, anxiety about the interview, it'll give you a little bit of time to be like, okay, I'm all prepped and ready to go. And you'll probably enter feeling a little bit more comfortable. And then I probably wouldn't try to join the interview until probably 5 to 10 minutes before,
Mhm.
just because often an interview schedule can be kind of tight. It'll be hour by hour potentially, and so that way you're not trying to join too soon when the employer may potentially be in an earlier interview with someone else. So I would have yourself ready 15 minutes before, and then I would try to join about 5 to 10 minutes before.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Unfortunately, Valentina is asking, what should I do if there's discrimination during the job interview?
That is a really good question, and I I would document whatever you feel is happening that seems to be that is feeling discriminatory, and then if you are not being interviewed by an HR professional, I would reach out to whomever is the HR professional for the organization that you're interviewing with. Um, and contact them to let them know. Obviously, it is illegal to do that, and so they should not be engaging in that. And I can see what other next steps you might want to take, and I can follow up on that.
Great, yeah, great question.
Yeah, that is an excellent question.
And I think Tanya is offering, I believe, some advice to the group that I believe this is around the appointments. So if you're asked when you can interview, oftentimes you have a choice in terms of what interview appointments you can take. And
Yeah.
Tanya, if that's not the question you're asking, please go ahead in the chat and clarify that. Can come up to talk to your boss. Oh. Oh, okay. Here's another question, and Tanya, if you want to clarify that one in the meantime in the chat. Jonathan has another great question. If I want a job, maybe there's a cool. I've always wanted to work at an ice cream shop, I'll just say.
Me too.
And yeah, so there's a cool ice cream shop that's opening. If I want that job, is it better to call there directly, to apply online, or fill out a paper application? What's a good way to make that first contact?
That's a really good question. Um, it's so dependent on the employer, really. So what I would probably do is, as much as possible, do a little bit of research about them. A lot of employers, obviously have some kind of website, and I would take a look at that and see if they have an employment section of their website that might give you some clues to that, because some places will tell you directly that they do not want you to show up and and try to get an interview, and that might be held against you. Other places will indicate that that is fine. They're happy to have someone just come in, but generally you'll want to kind of follow whatever procedure is outlined in a job posting. So some of them will say they want you to email your resume and a cover letter. Others will want you to fill out their particular online job application. I would, as much as possible, try to glean from the employer what it is that they would prefer. You can also just reach out, if you're not finding that information on their website as to what they prefer. There's usually some kind of generic or general email address that you can reach out to. If you're not finding that, I'd see if I can find an HR contact to reach out to and just ask them, what do you prefer that people you know apply via this method, or am I able to reach out in this way? Unfortunately, I wish I could tell you that there's a blanket response for that, but it's going to be very particular to the employer. So I'd probably do a little bit of research on that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And so there was just one question I think I'll clarify. I believe it was answered, was if the appointment keeps getting postponed, what do you do? And I think sometimes that's just going to happen, especially now, for some of the summer businesses, restaurants and things that are kind of opening, kind of not, they're going to be pretty busy. So if they tend to move appointments, I think that is sometimes to be expected, and to sort of go with the flow to the extent that you're comfortable. And this is a good question, again, from Daviana. And so how, if I find out a job is a scam after I'm hired, can I report that to the police? And sadly, I've seen a lot of those, especially online, that say, we'll pay you $1,000 and you get to travel. And unfortunately, there are people with bad intentions that take advantage of and try to hurt young people. So if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and definitely share it, with an adult. Or if it looks dangerous, if there are pictures and images that are inappropriate, it would probably be fair to call or report that to the police. Nicole, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I would reiterate what Val is saying. If it seems too good to be true, if they're, if the promise is lots of money for very little work, I can tell you right now that's not a real job.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not. And unfortunately, it is true that there's a lot of people who will prey on people out there. So if something seems fishy, doesn't seem quite right, I would investigate a little bit further before even engaging with that potential employer. You can look people up on the Better Business Bureau. You can kind of, do some searching online to see what kind of reputation they have. But yeah, I would report them to the police if there seems to be something that's highly, illegal or inappropriate going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then a follow-up on that one, or similar, tips on protecting your private information, social security or banking information before or during the interview. And so employers will ask for your social security number, and if they pay you online, they will ask for your banking information. So, but that wouldn't be until after you're hired. Nicole, any other advice that you might have?
Yeah, absolutely. I would reiterate that no employer is going to ask that information until they've made you a job offer. So if someone is asking for that information, like during the interview process or, anytime prior to you actually being confirmed that you're being offered a job, do not provide that. You are under no obligation to provide that prior to there being an actual job offer. And I would, not provide that information, particularly, online and, until for sure that it's a legitimate employer and that they are, using that information for legitimate purposes. The other thing that you can, that, you might want to consider, and this is not really totally in the interview realm, but there is the option to freeze your credit information. And so that can kind of prevent people from utilizing your information inappropriately. So that might be something to look into if you do have any concerns about, your information being utilized inappropriately.
Great. This is a great question Valentina is asking, and one that I never knew the answer to either. So I'm curious, is it okay if I ask about how many hours or the pay? So how do you start to have that financial question asked?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. I, generally, I would try to, get that information as soon as you can, just so that, that it's going to be a good fit for your needs. And typically most employers will provide that information up front somewhere. Usually there's some kind of guidance in terms of what the salary range might be, or what the hourly pay range might be. And so you are perfectly in your right to know that information before you go forward. And I would also ask about, number of, you can ask, what are the typical number of hours that a person in this position works? That way that you have a sense of what's expected. And you can even ask too about, how often are the schedules set? That's an important piece of information too. So you are well within your rights to ask those questions and find that out prior to, really at any point in the, in the process of applying for a job and in the interview.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I would just also add, just ask it in a professional way, just
Right.
as Nicole modeled. What would be the typical hours for this position? What's the typical pay for this positions? Things like that. And then
Yep.
Great questions. Those are all of the questions in the chat, and so we really thank you for your time. Nicole had offered to email some questions, so we do have your email addresses when you registered. Are you still willing to do that, Nicole, to send
Of
some?
course.
Excellent.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I will, yep, so I'll send out some typical interview questions that you might want to be prepared to answer.
Mhm.
I'll also see what I can find in terms of, besides contacting the HR department of a potential employers, if you feel like there's some discrimination going on in the interview process, what other steps you might be able to take, and I'll share that
Perfect.
information as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your participation, everyone. We wish you the best experience in finding your summer or part-time job, and have a wonderful afternoon. And we're getting Nicole some thank yous in the chat.
Oh, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day, especially on this, beautiful sunny day, to participate. So thanks for being here.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone.